Back here on the 757 at 6, we're joined by a special guest now. He covers Syracuse men's basketball and football teams for Syracuse.com. You can follow his work on Twitter, too, by clicking a follow there at C. Carlson on CU. We say good evening to Chris Carlson. Chris, how you doing out there?
Good, Matt. Good. A little colder than the 757, unfortunately, but a pretty good basketball team up here this winter.
Oh, no doubt about it. The Orange always in the hunt there under Jim Boeheim. And once upon a time, you worked in this market as a sports writer for the Virginia Pilot, so you're pretty familiar with the 757, huh?
Yeah, I covered Norfolk State football when they won that MEAC championship with Chris Wally and Pete Adrian, and then covered some Old Dominion basketball for a while. So, it's nice to hear a friendly voice, and hopefully some folks will remember me.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Glad to have you on the program, and we'll get to that Old Dominion matchup here in just a bit, coming up on Saturday as the Monarchs visit you guys up there in New York. But first, let's review the Orange basketball team right now. This past weekend, what a game. Down 15 to the Hoyas. Tyus Battle was dynamite in crunch time against Georgetown with 21 of his game-high 26 points in the second half. The game winner to boot. Tell me about that ball game as Syracuse won a doozy.
Yeah, their offense can be very, very kind of hit or miss. It missed a lot early. They were 1 for 14 on their first 14 3-point tries. Georgetown seemed to kind of control things for the first half, but they got some defensive stops. They got out and ran to start the second half and kind of really cut into the lead quickly. And then kind of once they were close, this is a Syracuse team that for the past couple years, they're really good when the game is close. They're really good late. Tyus Battle, Syracuse has had its share of clutch players. Jerry McNamara, Carmelo Anthony, but Tyus Battle is kind of right there with them as far as hitting late game shots and tough shots. He hit the game winner with 2.1 seconds left against Georgetown, and the half-court heave for Georgetown kind of went off the back rim. But kind of a really crazy finish. The lead changed 5 times over the last 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Another memorable moment in a rivalry that's pretty important for those two schools.
Oh, yeah, those great Big East days that go back to the 1980s with Boeheim and John Thompson and now Patrick Ewing, the head coach there. And I want to get back to this team in the ODU game in a second, but you get a chance to cover on a daily basis Jim Boeheim, who's one of the premier figures in college basketball. How would you characterize what it's like covering him on a regular basis?
It is constantly interesting. He's been around long enough. This is his 43rd year that he says what he wants. He answers how he wants. So you get far fewer kind of politically correct answers than you do with most players. Some people think that the journalists don't like it. Because if you ask a stupid question, he might tell you it's a stupid question, and that's not really fun. But the exchange to get actual honesty and actually interesting answers, when coaches are kind of being more and more vanilla in what they say to the media, it's a trade that any media member would actually make. So you have to be on your toes. There can be some uncomfortable moments, but there's far more good than bad.
Yeah, not very dull at all there with him. And this Syracuse team, certainly intriguing. They're 7-2. The lone losses to UConn and Oregon. They overcame that 15-point deficit that we mentioned to Georgetown on Saturday, beat Ohio State by 10 in Columbus earlier this year. 9 games in, what would you say the report card would read right now?
They're probably like C+, B-.
Okay.
They played without a point guard early in the year for those losses. So they've won all 5 of their games since Frank Howard, who's their starter, came back. He actually hasn't been very good. So it has not been a product of him playing well. But when he came back, Tyus Battle was able to shift back to shooting guard and come off screens and get some of the shots that he's more familiar with. And Battle has played great since Howard has come back. O'Shea Brissett is a really tough matchup for a lot of kind of these mid-major teams. He's 6'8", but he's athletic enough that he can take the ball outside, and he's strong enough that if you try to defend him with somebody smaller, he's going to take that guy down at the block. Those are their 2 big players. Elijah Hughes, who's a transfer from East Carolina, he's eligible eligible this year, and he kind of makes it a big three for them right now. And the way teams are defending them, that they're sagging off Howard because he's not being very good, and then Syracuse's centers are kind of offensive non-factors. So you're getting a lot of help defense toward those three, and the offense can be a little stagnant at times. Those guys can be asked to hit a lot of tough shots, which they do enough, but it hasn't been pretty. And then obviously you know about the 2-3 zone. It's not pretty for the opposing teams very often either.
We're chatting with Chris Carlson. He covers Syracuse men's basketball and football teams for Syracuse.com. Read his work there as well as follow him on Twitter at CCarlson on SU. It's the 757 at 6 on ESPN Radio 94.1 as we get you set with in-depth info on the Syracuse Orange basketball team as they play host to Old Dominion on Saturday. Our coverage beginning following high school sports talk at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday with the pregame show with Ted Alexander and Dave Twardzik right here on ESPN Radio 94.1, getting you set for tip-off at noon. And Chris, what's your sense of this Old Dominion basketball team? You know, from the years covering them, they've always been in the hunt. What's kind of your take right now on how they look against the matchup with Syracuse?
You know, it's interesting in that, obviously I think it's going to be a pretty defensive game. Old Dominion's played pretty tough defense this whole season. The best 2-point defense in the country, number 8 in effective field goal percentage. That can frustrate a lot of teams. The one area where this isn't great for Old Dominion probably is Syracuse tends not to shoot the ball well a lot, but they don't get frustrated by that. They're a team that does a pretty good job playing hard and relying on their defense, rather than getting focused on offense. So, one of the things, the strengths of Old Dominion, I think it's mitigated a little bit by kind of how Syracuse plays. It's going to be really slow, so that's a good thing for an upset. The possession count will be low, so Syracuse's talent advantage might not be able to, generate a ton of points. But the fact that both teams rely on their defense and Syracuse is better, I do think it is a tough matchup for Old Dominion. I think they have the same mentality, but Syracuse is just better.
Yeah, you hear the numbers always first to 60 or 70 wins. This might be a game where first to 40 wins the ball game with Syracuse and ODU coming up on Saturday. And Chris, obviously the Orange have big sights and goals this year. Maybe they can be a Final Four level team. Who knows? The ACC schedule coming up in January and February. We'll be watching some of the big matchups with the likes of UVA and UNC and Duke. These next two games, though, ODU's a team that's knocking on that tournament door. Even coming up on Tuesday night, Buffalo, the number 14 team in the land on ESPN2. How would you kind of look at these two games with ODU and Buffalo? How dangerous are they for Syracuse, these next two?
Yeah, Old Dominion's a game that they certainly could lose it. I think Syracuse would have to play pretty poorly to lose it, but Old Dominion's capable of beating Syracuse. And I mean, Buffalo's really, really good. They came to Syracuse last year. I thought they were actually the better team on the floor that day. They played really hard, really, really physical. They go up and down, and it's part of a big week for Buffalo. They play Syracuse, and then they play Marquette, and they feel like if they can split those two games, they have a really good chance of getting an at-large bid where they don't have to necessarily win their conference tournament. Buffalo's already beaten West Virginia this year. So, it is a very, very tricky week for Syracuse, especially getting up emotionally for those games with the ACC schedule looming. This is obviously a huge game for Old Dominion. It's a huge game for Buffalo. And if you don't match the energy early, that can be a problem. And Syracuse has struggled with that at points this year. When they lost to UConn, 83-76 in New York City, UConn kind of came out and punched them in the mouth, and Syracuse never got back into it. Georgetown punched Syracuse in the mouth and really kind of threw Syracuse off by playing physical defense early. Now Syracuse was able to come back, but that's something that both Old Dominion and Buffalo can try to take advantage of. The fact that this is a much bigger game for them than it might be on Syracuse. Syracuse just has so many chances to win big games with that ACC schedule that it's just not quite as critical.
Very good point. Last one on the basketball side. Thanks for your Chris. Before we move on to football and close up here, we're talking with Chris Carlson. You can follow him on Twitter at @CCarlson on SU. He covers Syracuse men's basketball and football for Syracuse.com. It's the 757 at 6 on ESPN Radio 94.1. You mentioned earlier Frank Howard, out of a player that once played in Virginia at Paul VI up there in Fairfax. Is he the X factor, or would you point to a different player or area that's going to be the X factor for this team long term?
Yeah, I think they came into the season with hopes of being a Final Four team. I don't think that can be an expectation. I don't think they're quite that good, but they're good enough to get there. To get there, they need at least four guys on offense who are going to be threats. The centers just aren't really going to be that guy. But if they can have four offensive threats on the floor at once, you can't help too much off of that. And getting Frank Howard going is the biggest piece of that, because the other three have been pretty good. Howard had a sprained ankle that caused him to sit out the team's first 4 games this year. He hasn't had the same explosiveness since he's been back. Last year he was really good at kind of beating that first defender, making the defense adjust, and then kind of kicking out especially. This year they have far more offensive weapons for him to kick to, but he's struggled to beat that first defender just because he doesn't have that same explosiveness. But it's a sprained ankle. You expect that to come back over the course of the season, and when it does, Frank Howard makes this team a pretty good offensive team to go with a potentially dominant defensive team.
It's been a pretty darn good year on the football side of things for Syracuse, too. I mean, we're so used to here in ACC country on the football side of things talking about UVA and Virginia Tech, and we're watching Clemson in the Final Four yet again with Dabo Swinney. We've got players that tend to go down to the Floridas like a Florida State, but 9-3, second in the ACC Atlantic. Got a big win over FSU, only lost to Clemson by 4, lost to Pitt in OT, but going to a big bowl here with West Virginia in the Camping World Bowl. Has some of the steam been taken out of it with Will Greer skipping the bowl to focus on the draft?
It's been so long. I mean, this is Syracuse's best football season since 2001. They went through some years where they were just dreadful, and more recently they've been mediocre. Syracuse fans are just so excited to watch good, competent football again that they don't care who they play in the bowl game. These seniors have never been to a bowl. The past couple years they've been close, and they've had kind of late season fades and injuries. So this bowl game kind of means a lot to them. They consider this kind of proving that they're a quality football team. I think Syracuse is ready to just go down and kind of go gangbusters in Orlando. And West Virginia, as you mentioned, without Will Greer, their left tackle is also kind of sitting out that game to prepare for the NFL draft. That to me seems like a team that isn't really thrilled about being there. I think Syracuse is, I don't think there's any steam lost for Syracuse. I don't know that the game's going to be thrilling, because I think you've got one team that's really excited to be there and one team that's not.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. And looking at what Dino Babers has done there, I mean, we saw them, not too long ago, just last year, beat Clemson. I mean, this is a program that
they beat Virginia Tech 2 years ago. Well,
yeah.
Virginia Tech was ranked when they came up here.
Sure. I mean, so they've had some big moments here. I mean, what would 10 wins, a bowl victory do? I mean, can this have a big effect on recruiting, you think, moving into next year?
Yeah, I think more probably 2 years down the line.
Okay.
You know that it takes a year for you to kind of get into the living room with those kids and build relationships, but before you kind of see the big boost. But they're playing a really, really fun offensive style. They're going to be good again next year, barring a ton of injuries. Eric Dungy is their quarterback, and he gets a lot of publicity because of the style he plays. He's a quarterback who loves to lower his shoulder and be a physical runner. But they've got a kid coming in next year, or he's already here. He's a redshirt freshman, Tommy DeVito, one of the best quarterback prospects they've had for a while. And he throws a much better ball than Dungy. And he's going to be working in this system. They've got a running back who transferred in this year who will be eligible. They got a wide receiver from Michigan State who transferred in this year who will be eligible, as well as most of the skill guys back. So you're talking about probably a pretty good 2-year stretch. And then all of a sudden, you're not the team that kind of overachieved, right? You're actually able to sell yourself as a program that is capable of playing on that level regularly. So, I think they're a danger as long as Dino Babers is the coach here. And that's probably the worry here, as well as most places. The Purdue locked their guy up, Iowa State locked their guy up. We're kind of waiting this offseason to see if Syracuse is able to do the same thing with Dino Babers long term.
Well, he definitely has them on the rise, and some great times up there in Syracuse, New York, with the football and the men's basketball team. They'll be in action on Saturday. Old Dominion paying a visit to Syracuse, and again, we have coverage beginning at Saturday, 11:30 a.m. with our pregame show, and then Ted Alexander Company with tip-off right here on your home for ODU basketball. It's ESPN Radio 94.1. We thank Chris Carlson. You can follow him on Twitter at @CCarlson on SU. He does terrific work covering men's basketball and football for Syracuse.com. Chris, thanks so much for the time, and we'll talk soon.
Matt, so glad to hear your voice, and thanks for taking the time.
You bet. Chris Carlson with us here on the 757 at 6, covering Syracuse men's basketball and football for Syracuse.com here on ESPN Radio 94.1.